A first-class ticket is supposed to be a passport to comfort a promise of respect. For Dr. Emma Reed, a world-renowned astrophysicist on her way to accept a prestigious award, it was anything but. On a transatlantic flight aboard the luxurious Airlines, she was met with a wall of silent contempt. Her requests were ignored, her presence dismissed, her dignity chipped away with every passing mile at 35,000 feet. The flight crew saw a black woman and decided she didn't belong. But they made one colossal mistake. They didn't know who was waiting for her on the tarmac, a man whose 2 words, "My Queen," would not only shatter their careers, but expose a truth that would rock the entire airline industry to its core. This isn't just a story about bad service, it's a story of hidden prejudice, stunning revelation, and the devastating life-altering karma that follows. The hum of the Rolls-Royce engines on the Airbus A350 was a familiar lullaby to Dr. Emma Reed. She was a frequent flyer, a woman whose life was a series of transitions between continents, conferences, and observatories. Her work mapping the cosmic microwave background radiation demanded a global presence. This trip, however, was different. She wasn't flying to a lecture. She was flying to London to receive the Eddington Medal, one of astrophysics' highest honors. Her journey began with a subtle friction at the JFK check-in counter for Airlines, a boutique carrier that prided itself on unparalleled luxury and bespoke service. The agent, a young man named Mark, had glanced at her passport, then at her first-class ticket, then back at her face. A flicker of something confusion, suspicion, crossed his features before being replaced by a professionally blank mask. He'd processed her ticket with a clipped efficiency that felt less like service and more like a transaction he wanted to be over with. Emma, accustomed to the quiet paper cuts of racial bias, had simply offered a polite smile and moved on. Now settled into seat 2A, a spacious pod of cream leather and polished burr walnut, she felt a familiar sense of detachment settling in. She was the only black person in the 28-seat first-class cabin. It was a fact like observing a solitary star in a distant galaxy. It didn't define her, but it often defined how others interacted with her. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with sharp, bird-like features and a name tag that read Brenda, was making her rounds with the pre-departure champagne. She moved with a practiced, almost theatrical grace, her voice a low conspiratorial murmur to the passengers. She offered a warm, crinkle-eyed smile to the businessman in 1A, shared a light laugh with the couple in 1D and 1G, and took her time topping up the glass of the elderly woman across the aisle. When she reached Emma, the performance ceased. The warmth vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cool, flat professionalism. Champagne, she asked, her tone devoid of the warmth she'd offered others. It wasn't a question, it was a function. "Yes, please." "Thank you," Emma replied, her voice calm and even. Brenda poured the champagne without a word, her movements swift and impersonal. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't say, "Enjoy your flight." She simply moved on the curtain of her hospitality, dropping as quickly as it had risen. A junior flight attendant, a younger, nervous-looking blonde named Heather, shadowed her, mimicking Brenda's cool demeanor towards Emma, though with a less practiced edge. Emma sighed, taking a small sip of the Laurent Perrier. It was excellent, but the taste was soured by the familiar chill of being treated as an anomaly. She wasn't a guest to be welcomed. She was a task to be completed. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers filled with complex equations, her final review of the speech she was to give. Work was her sanctuary, a place where the only thing that mattered was the elegant, immutable logic of the universe. As the plane taxied and took off, soaring into the darkening sky, the service began. Brenda and Heather moved through the cabin taking dinner orders. Again, the pattern repeated itself. With other passengers, Brenda was engaging, descriptive, and patient. "The pan-seared salmon is particularly delightful this evening, Mr. Henderson with a lemon dill reduction that is simply divine," she cooed to the man in 1A. When she stood beside Emma's seat, her notepad poised, her expression was impatient. "Your choice, I'd love the salmon, please," Emma said. Brenda didn't write it down. She gave a thin, dismissive smile. "I'm afraid the salmon is a very popular choice. We're likely already out. It's best to have a second option." It was an odd thing to say before even checking. The cabin was barely a third full. "Oh. Well, in that case, the beef fillet would be my second choice." "I'll see what's available," Brenda said, her tone implying that Emma's preference was an inconvenience. She turned and walked away before Emma could even request a drink. An hour later, the scent of pan-seared salmon wafted from the galley. Emma watched as Heather served the dish to Mr. Henderson in 1A. Then, to her surprise, she watched Heather serve the exact same dish to the woman in 3A, the seat directly behind her. When Brenda finally arrived with Emma's meal, she placed a plate of beef on her tray table. It looked perfectly fine, but the lie stung more than the slight. "I see the salmon was available after all," Emma stated not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. Brenda's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. "We had just enough for the passengers who pre-ordered. You should consider doing so on your next flight." Emma knew for a fact she hadn't been given a pre-order option. It was another lie, a small, petty fortification in the wall of disrespect they were building around her. She decided for the sake of her own peace to let it go. Arguing would only invite more hostility. She would eat her meal, watch a film, and try to sleep. But the crew seemed determined to deny her even that small piece. Her call button, pressed to request a glass of water, went unanswered for 20 minutes until she finally flagged down Heather, who responded with an exasperated sigh. A request for an extra blanket was met with a curt, "We'll see if we have any left, though." Emma could see a neat stack of them in a nearby overhead bin. Every interaction was designed to make her feel invisible, to make her feel like an intruder in a space they believed she hadn't earned. They weren't overtly rude in a way that could be easily reported. There were no slurs, no raised voices. It was a masterclass in passive aggression, a death by 1,000 micro-insults, all delivered with a veneer of professional service that was in itself the deepest insult of all. Emma leaned her head against the cool window, watching the distant glittering stars. Up there in the silent, cold void, everything followed predictable laws. Gravity light time. There was a beautiful, irrefutable order to it all. Down here, inside a metal tube, hurtling through the sky, the laws were arbitrary, nonsensical, and cruel, dictated by the whims and prejudices of people like Brenda. And the flight was far from over. The cabin lights had been dimmed for several hours, casting the first-class section in a soft blue glow. Most passengers were asleep, cocooned in their lie-flat beds. Emma, however, couldn't rest. The quiet hostility had settled in her stomach like a lead weight. She had given up on trying to sleep and was attempting to lose herself in a film, but her in-flight entertainment screen kept freezing. After the third time it stuttered and pixelated into a frozen image, she sighed and pressed the call button. She waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The button's amber light glowed unanswered. She could hear Brenda and Heather chatting quietly in the galley, their laughter occasionally cutting through the low hum of the engines. It was clear they were ignoring her. With quiet resolve, Emma unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and walked the few steps to the forward galley. The curtain was partially drawn. Brenda and Heather were leaning against a counter, scrolling on their phones. They looked up as she approached, their expressions shifting from relaxed boredom to undisguised annoyance. "My screen seems to be malfunctioning," Emma said softly, not wanting to disturb the other passengers. "It keeps freezing. Would it be possible to have it reset?" Brenda didn't move. She looked Emma up and down, a faint smirk on her lips. "These systems can be quite sensitive. You have to use the remote properly. Are you sure you're not just pressing the wrong buttons?" The condescension was thick and suffocating. "I'm quite sure," Emma replied, her patience wearing dangerously thin. "I've been flying for 20 years. I know how to operate a remote control. I believe the unit needs a system reset from your end." "I'll get to it when I have a moment," Brenda said dismissively, turning her attention back to her phone. It was a clear dismissal. Emma stood there for a moment, stunned by the blatant disrespect. She was being treated like a child, an idiot. She returned to her seat, her jaw tight with a mixture of anger and humiliation. This was no longer about bad service. This was a deliberate, targeted campaign of disrespect. About 15 minutes later, Heather appeared at her seat, not with an apology, but with a cup of coffee Emma hadn't ordered. "Here," Heather said, her voice flat. "Brenda thought you might want this." She leaned across Emma to place the cup on the small console next to the seat. It was a clumsy, awkward movement. As she pulled back her elbow, jostled the cup, hot coffee sloshed over the side, splashing onto Emma's cream-colored silk blouse and the sleeve of her blazer. Emma gasped more from shock than the heat, which was thankfully muted by the fabric. Heather's eyes widened, but not with apology, with panic. "Oh, look what you made me do!" She blurted out the accusation, stunning Emma into silence. Brenda was there in an instant, drawn by the small commotion. She didn't look at Emma. She didn't ask if she was okay. Her eyes were fixed on the coffee stain spreading on the leather armrest. "For heaven's sake," Brenda hissed, grabbing a handful of napkins. "These seats are Italian leather. This will stain." She began dabbing aggressively at the seat, completely ignoring Emma, who was now standing up, trying to blot the hot liquid from her clothes. "I believe your crew member spilled this on me," Emma said, her voice dangerously calm. The astrophysicist, the calm academic, was gone. In her place was a woman who had reached her limit. Brenda finally looked up at her, her eyes like chips of ice. "Heather said you startled her as she was placing the cup down. We are instructed to be very careful with the upholstery. Perhaps you should be more mindful of your movements." The sheer audacity of it left Emma breathless. They had spilled coffee on her, and were now not only blaming her but scolding her for potentially damaging the furniture. It was surreal. It was gaslighting at 35,000 feet. "Are you actually serious?" Emma asked, her voice low but carrying the full weight of her disbelief. "You are more concerned about your seat than your passenger, Mr. Henderson." In 1A, awakened by the low voices, peered over his seat. He saw the flight attendants fussing over the chair, while a black woman stood there with a large coffee stain on her blouse. He frowned, then put on his noise-cancelling headphones and turned away, absolving himself of any involvement. "Our priority is the safety and integrity of the cabin," Ma'am Brenda said, her voice dripping with false formality. She handed Emma a small damp towel. "Here, for your blouse." It was the final, most galling insult. The towel felt like a token thrown at a beggar. The message was clear. You are the problem. Your clothes are your issue. The airline's property is paramount. Emma took the towel. She didn't use it. She just held it in her hand, the dampness seeping into her palm. She looked from Brenda's smug, contemptuous face to Heather's nervous, guilty one. They had made their position clear, and in that moment, Emma Reed made a decision. She would not let this go. They had mistaken her quiet dignity for weakness. They were about to learn how wrong they were. She would not cause a scene, not here. But there would be a reckoning. She was certain of it. She sat back down, the damp stain on her blouse, a cold reminder of the promise she was making to herself. For the next hour, Emma sat in silence. She didn't touch the damp towel. She didn't try to use her malfunctioning screen. She let the coffee stain on her blouse dry into a dark, ugly map of her humiliation. But inside, a cold fury was coalescing into a sharp, focused point. She was a scientist. She dealt in facts, in evidence, in direct observation. And the evidence was overwhelming. She waited until Brenda was making a final pass through the cabin before landing. She pressed her call button, this time knowing she could not ignore it with a senior crew member, present a different flight attendant. A man who had been working in the business cabin came over. "Yes, ma'am," he asked politely. "I would like to speak to the lead flight attendant, Brenda, at her convenience." Emma said, her voice measured and clear. A few minutes later, Brenda appeared, her expression a mask of weary impatience. "Yes." Emma looked her directly in the eye. She did not raise her voice. She used what her graduate students called her black hole lecture voice, impossibly calm, deeply resonant, and suggesting a density of intelligence that was not to be trifled with. "Brenda," she began, "I feel it's necessary for us to have a clear understanding of the service on this flight. From the moment I boarded, I have been treated with a level of dismissiveness that is profoundly different from the treatment of other passengers in this cabin." Brenda's posture stiffened. "I'm not sure what you're implying, ma'am." "I'm not implying anything. I am stating facts." Emma continued, her gaze unwavering. "Fact 1, I was denied my first meal choice under the false pretense that it was unavailable, while the passenger directly behind me was served that very meal minutes later. Fact 2, my call button has been repeatedly and deliberately ignored. Fact 3, when I reported a malfunctioning screen, you condescended to me, suggesting I was incapable of operating it, and then failed to reset it. Fact 4, your junior crew member spilled hot coffee on me, and you not only blamed me for the incident, but prioritized the upholstery of the seat over my well-being." She paused, letting the words hang in the air between them. "This is not a simple matter of poor service. This is a consistent pattern of discriminatory and disrespectful behavior, and I will not tolerate it." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in Brenda's eyes. She had expected hysterics, a loud complaint she could easily dismiss as an overreaction. She had not expected this. She had not expected a calm, systematic dismantling of her conduct. She quickly regained her composure, falling back on her ingrained sense of superiority. "Ma'am," she said, her voice taking on a saccharine, patronizing tone, "Aura Airlines prides itself on its impeccable standards. Perhaps you are simply not accustomed to our specific protocols. Flying first class can be an overwhelming experience for some." The insinuation was as clear as it was vile. "You, the black woman, are out of your depth. You don't belong here, and your discomfort is your own fault." It was the most offensive thing Brenda could have said, and it sealed her fate. Emma felt a stillness come over her. "Overwhelming," she repeated, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "My dear woman, I calculate the trajectories of interstellar objects for a living. I assure you, I am not overwhelmed by a reclining chair and a glass of champagne. What I am overwhelmed by is your breathtaking unprofessionalism and thinly veiled bigotry." She picked up the small damp towel she had been holding for the last hour and held it out to Brenda. "You should keep this," Emma said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "as a souvenir of this conversation. When this flight lands, I will be filing a formal complaint, not just with customer service. I will be taking this to the highest levels of your corporate structure. I will detail every slight, every lie, and every insult, and I will be sure to mention your expert opinion that I am simply not accustomed to your service." Brenda stared at the towel, then at Emma's face. She saw no anger now, no frustration. She saw something far more terrifying, absolute conviction. The power dynamic had shifted. Brenda was no longer the queen of her cabin. She was a functionary who had just made a catastrophic error in judgment. She snatched the towel from Emma's hand. "You do whatever you feel you have to, ma'am." She snapped her voice tight with a mixture of fury and fear. She turned on her heel and stalked back to the galley, the professional mask finally shattered, revealing the ugly Prejudice beneath. Emma leaned back in her seat and finally closed her eyes. The captain announced their initial descent into London Heathrow. The confrontation was over. The consequences were yet to come. The grey, damp light of a London morning filtered through the windows as the A350 made its final approach. The landing was smooth, the taxi to the gate uneventful. The usual polite chaos of deplaning began the clicking of seatbelts, the rustle of clothing, the soft thud of overhead bins being opened. Emma remained seated calmly, gathering her papers and placing them back into her leather briefcase. She was in no rush. Brenda and Heather stood at the doorway, their professional smiles plastered back on, bidding farewell to the departing passengers. When Mr. Henderson from 1A passed, Brenda gave him a warm, "Such a pleasure having you with us again, sir." When Emma approached, Brenda's smile became a tight, bloodless line. She said nothing. Heather avoided eye contact altogether, staring at a point just past Emma's shoulder. Emma walked down the jet bridge without a backward glance. She entered the terminal, her mind already shifting to the logistics of getting to her hotel and preparing for the awards ceremony that evening. She expected to navigate the familiar maze of immigration and baggage claim. But something was different. Standing just past the end of the jet bridge, creating a small island of stillness in the river of disembarking passengers, were two people. One was a uniformed airport official. The other was a man who commanded attention without demanding it. He was tall and lean, perhaps in his early 60s, with a mane of silver hair swept back from a high forehead. He was dressed in a bespoke, charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin. His face was sharp and intelligent, and as he scanned the crowd, his eyes held an air of impatient authority. He was Alistair Finch, the founder and majority owner of Aura Airlines, a reclusive, almost mythical figure in the aviation world, known for his obsession with quality and his notorious intolerance for failure. The passengers streaming past him barely gave him a second look, assuming he was waiting for some diplomat or celebrity. Brenda and Heather, who had just exited the jet bridge behind the last passenger, froze. They recognized him instantly from company-wide memos and the cover of Forbes magazine. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, washed over them. Why was he here? Was there a surprise inspection? Alistair's sharp eyes continued to scan the faces. Then he saw her. The impatience vanished, and his entire demeanor transformed. A smile of pure, unadulterated affection lit up his face, erasing the years and the stern reputation. He ignored the airport official. He ignored the stunned flight attendants. He strode forward, his steps purposeful, closing the distance between them. He walked straight past a dozen other first-class passengers until he stood directly in front of Dr. Emma Reed. He took both of her hands in his. "Evie," he said, his voice a warm, rich baritone that cut through the airport noise. "You're here." Emma's weary face broke into a genuine, brilliant smile. "Alistair, you didn't have to come all this way." "Nonsense," he scoffed gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked her up and down, his gaze settling for a fraction of a second on the dark stain on her blouse. His smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He leaned in and kissed her warmly on both cheeks. Then, still holding her hands, and in a voice loud enough for those nearby, including the petrified Brenda and Heather, to hear clearly, he said the two words that changed everything. "My queen." He beamed at her. "The queen of the cosmos has arrived. How was your flight?" Brenda Jenkins felt the blood drain from her face. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "My queen." The words echoed in her mind, a death knell for her career. This wasn't a disgruntled passenger. This wasn't some random woman who'd won a contest for a first-class seat. This was family, or something even more important. Heather looked like she was about to faint. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. They hadn't just insulted a passenger. They had insulted Alistair Finch's queen. Alistair, oblivious to the drama unfolding behind Emma, tucked her arm into his. "We'll bypass the rabble of immigration. I have a car waiting on the tarmac. We can talk on the way into the city. Your father would have my head if I let you stand in a queue." He gestured for the airport official, who immediately led them towards a private door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." As they walked away, Alistair glanced back over his shoulder. His eyes, no longer warm, met Brenda's. For a single terrifying second, he held her gaze. There was no anger in his expression. It was something far worse. It was a cold, clinical assessment, the look of a man identifying a flaw in his machinery, a flaw that would be swiftly and ruthlessly corrected. He then turned back to Emma, his smile returning instantly. "Tell me, Evie, how was the service? My crew took good care of you, I trust." He asked, his tone light but with an underlying steel that Emma, who knew him well, recognized instantly. Emma paused. She looked at his kind, expectant face, then thought of the calculated cruelty of the past 7 hours. "Alistair," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "We need to talk." The private lounge deep within the airport's VIP suite was a haven of silence and understated luxury. Soft leather armchairs, a fully stocked bar, and panoramic windows overlooking the airfield. But the atmosphere was anything but relaxed. It was charged with a tense, controlled fury that emanated from Alistair Finch. He had personally poured Emma a glass of sparkling water, his movements precise and deliberate. He had insisted she sit, making her comfortable before he addressed the elephant in the room. The stain on her blouse was a silent, screaming accusation. "All right, Evie," he said, his voice low and serious as he sat opposite her. He had known Emma since she was a precocious teenager. Her father, the legendary Dr. James Reed, had been more than Alistair's PhD advisor at Cambridge. He had been a mentor, a friend, and the closest thing to a father Alistair had ever known. When James passed away, Alistair had sworn to always look out for his brilliant daughter. He called her "my queen," not just as a term of endearment, but out of a profound, almost reverential respect for her and her father's legacy. "You said we needed to talk," Alistair prompted gently. "Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. I need to know every single detail." Emma, who had never been one for drama, hesitated. "Alistair, it was just a few unpleasant flight attendants. I was going to file a complaint." "No." He interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is my airline. My name is on the tail fin. The ethos of this company is built on one principal dignity. For everyone. What happened on that aircraft happened in my house, so please, tell me." So she did. In her clear, factual, scientific manner, she recounted the entire experience. She started with the dismissive check-in agent, Mark. She described Brenda's Jekyll and Hyde transformation of hospitality, the lie about the salmon, the ignored call buttons, the condescension about the entertainment system. She detailed the coffee incident, Heather's clumsiness, the immediate accusation, and Brenda's shocking concern for the leather seat over her passenger. And then she delivered the final damning piece of evidence. When I confronted her about her behavior, she suggested that I was not accustomed to the standards of first-class service. Alistair's face, which had been growing progressively harder, became a mask of cold fury. His knuckles were white where he gripped the arm of his chair. That single phrase confirmed everything. It wasn't incompetence. It wasn't a bad day. It was calculated, prejudiced cruelty. It was the one thing he would not tolerate. He listened without interruption until she was finished. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. "They did this to you," he said more to himself than to her. "To James Reed's daughter, in my Airline." He stood up and paced the room, his movements like a caged panther. The sheer, unmitigated arrogance. To assume, to decide based on nothing but the color of your skin that you were unworthy of basic human decency. He stopped pacing and looked at her. "Evie, I am so profoundly sorry. That this happened anywhere is an outrage. That it happened under my flag is a personal failure." "It's not your fault, Alistair," she said softly. "The hell it isn't," he shot back, his voice sharp. "It's my name, my crew, my responsibility, and I will deal with it." He walked over to a phone on the console and pressed a single button. "Danielson," he said, his voice cold as ice. The man on the other end was Danielson Pike, his head of European operations, a man who knew that a call like this from Finch meant a crisis of the highest order. "Alistair, is everything all right?" "No, Danielson, it is not," Finch said. "I want you to activate a code Nightingale on flight AU-1001 from JFK, which landed 40 minutes ago." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Code Nightingale was a rarely used protocol reserved for the most severe breaches of crew conduct or safety. It meant the entire on-duty crew was to be immediately grounded, their credentials suspended, and they were not to leave the airport until an inquiry was complete. "Understood, Alistair. May I ask the nature?" "The nature is a catastrophic failure of service and a violation of the Aura Code of Conduct. Section 1, Article 1, Unassailable Dignity. I want the entire flight and gate crew from that flight, the pilots, the flight attendants, and the gate agent who checked in Dr. Reed in conference room 4 in exactly 1 hour. Have Cynthia from HR meet you there. And patch in legal on a secure line." He paused. "And Danielson, bring the complete service jackets for a lead flight attendant, Brenda Jenkins, flight attendant, Heather Mills, and gate agent Mark Corrigan. I also want the full audio logs from the first-class cabin recorder for the last 8 hours." "Understood. Completely, Alistair," Danielson replied, his voice now grim. Alistair hung up the phone. He turned back to Emma, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry to subject you to this, Evie, but I need you there. They need to see you. They need to understand the gravity of what they have done." Emma nodded slowly. She hadn't wanted this level of fuss, but she understood. This was no longer just about her. It was about Alistair's promise to her father. It was about the integrity of an entire airline. It was about ensuring that no one else ever had to endure the quiet, soul-crushing humiliation she had experienced on flight AU-101. The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. Airport Conference Room 4 was a soulless, sterile box, a purgatory of grey walls and fluorescent lighting. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces around it, creating distorted funereal portraits. The air itself felt heavy, thick with a silence that was louder than any shouting could ever be. At one end sat Alistair Finch, his face an unreadable granite slab, and Dr. Emma Reed, a study in calm composure. They were flanked by Danielson Pike, whose expression was a mixture of fury and embarrassment, and Cynthia Davies, the head of HR, whose file-laden laptop was the only object on their side of the table. At the other end, the accused sat like prisoners in the dock. Brenda Jenkins was a statue of defiance, her back ramrod straight, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. But the rigid posture was betrayed by the frantic terror swimming in her eyes. Beside her, Heather Mills had dissolved. Her face was blotchy and tear-streaked, and she trembled uncontrollably, her gaze fixed on the tabletop, as if hoping it might swallow her whole. Mark Corrigan, the gate agent, seemed to have shrunk inside his suit. He fidgeted with his tie, his eyes darting around the room, a cornered animal looking for an escape that didn't exist. The two pilots, Captain Evans and his first officer, sat apart from them, their faces etched with a grim confusion that was slowly hardening into professional disgust as they began to grasp the nature of the summons. Cynthia Davies began, her voice, crisp and devoid of emotion, cutting through the tension. "We are here to investigate a Code Nightingale incident reported on Flight AU-101. These are serious allegations concerning a severe breach of professional conduct. This is a formal inquiry, and everything said here is on the record." She looked first at the gate agent. "Mr. Corrigan, let's begin with check-in. Our service metrics show that the average check-in time for a first-class passenger at your station yesterday was 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Your interaction with Dr. Reed lasted 42 seconds. Can you account for this remarkable yet anomalous efficiency?" Mark paled, swallowing hard. I don't know. She had her papers in order. It was a quick transaction." "A transaction," Cynthia repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "Not a welcome. Not a service interaction?" She made a note and turned to Brenda. "Ms. Jenkins, as the lead flight attendant, can you describe your interactions with Dr. Reed during the flight?" Brenda lifted her chin, her voice brittle. "Dr. Reed was a passenger in seat 2A. We provided her with the standard first-class service, as per ORA guidelines." The standard service, Alistair Finch spoke for the first time, his voice dangerously quiet. The question sliced through Brenda's fragile composure. "Let's examine that standard. Miss Davies, please play the audio log from the forward galley timestamp 02:45 GMT. A technician clicked a mouse. The clear audio of Emma's polite voice filled the room. "My screen seems to be malfunctioning. Would it be possible to have it reset?" Then came Brenda's reply, her own voice, a weapon of condescension. "These systems can be quite sensitive. You have to use the remote properly. Are you sure you're not just pressing the wrong buttons?" Brenda flinched as if struck. Captain Evans shot her a look of utter disbelief. "Now the log from seat 2A, timestamp 03:10 GMT. Alistair commanded, his eyes locked on Brenda. The audio played the clatter of the cup, Emma's gasp, and then Heather's panicked accusatory bleat, "Oh, look what you made me do!" It was followed immediately by Brenda's sharp hiss, a sound of pure contempt. "For heaven's sake, these seats are Italian leather. This will stain." At the sound of her own voice, Heather finally broke, burying her face in her hands, with a gut-wrenching sob. The sound was horrifyingly loud in the quiet room. "And finally," Alistair said, his voice dropping to the temperature of ice, "the interaction at timestamp 04:30 GMT. Emma's calm, factual recitation of the crew's failures played out, followed by the damning climax. Brenda's voice, syrupy with false concern, echoed from the speakers. Perhaps you are simply not accustomed to our specific protocols. Flying first class can be an overwhelming experience for some. A tomb-like silence fell when the recording stopped. It was a complete confession, delivered in their own voices. Alistair Finch stood up slowly, the movement full of controlled menace. For 15 years, he began, I have built this airline on a non-negotiable principle. We fly planes, but we serve people. We serve them with dignity. I learned that principle from a man who taught me everything, a man who believed the most ignorant person on earth is the one who thinks they know everything about someone just by looking at them. He gestured towards Emma. This is Dr. Emma Reed. She is the daughter of my mentor, Dr. James Reed. But that is irrelevant. What is relevant is that you looked at a passenger, and in your breathtaking arrogance, you judged, you belittled, and you excluded. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, his gaze a physical force. You, Miss Jenkins, you were the captain of that cabin's culture, and you steered it directly into an iceberg of bigotry. You took the pride of this uniform and twisted it into a shroud for your own prejudice. He turned to Heather. Kindness costs nothing, Miss Mills, yet you found yourself bankrupt. You chose cowardly complicity over basic human decency. His eyes fell on Mark. And you, Mr. Corrigan, you were the first gate, the first impression of a billion-dollar brand. You acted like a bouncer at a cheap nightclub. He stood straight again. Cynthia. Proceed. Effective immediately. Cynthia announced. The employment of Brenda Jenkins, Heather Mills and Mark Corrigan with Aura Airlines is terminated for gross misconduct. You can't! Brenda shrieked, her composure shattering completely. She leapt to her feet. I have 20 years of loyal service. It was her Heather. She spilled the coffee. She's clumsy. She's inexperienced. Alistair's laugh was a short, sharp, mirthless sound. Loyal service, I read your file this morning, Brenda. Complaint 2019. Dismissive and hostile attitude towards a businessman from Dubai. You claimed he was aggressive. Complaint 2022. Unaccommodating and rude to a family from Lagos. You claimed a language barrier. It's all here, a clear pattern of behavior towards anyone you deemed didn't look the part. This wasn't a mistake. It was a rehearsal. You are done in this industry. Brenda stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently, her hatred for him, for Emma, for her own ruin burning in her eyes. Security guards entered the room and moved towards the three of them. Alistair turned to the pilots. You are cleared. But know this, you command the aircraft, but you are also responsible for the culture on board. A sickness like this festered under your command. Be more vigilant. As the guards escorted a sobbing Heather and a shell-shocked Mark out. Brenda paused at the door. She looked past Alistair, past the guards, her gaze locking with Emma's. It was a look of pure, undiluted venom, the impotent rage of a tyrant dethroned. Emma met her gaze, not with triumph, but with a deep, weary sadness. Justice had been served, but the victory felt hollow, a grim necessity, in a battle she never should have had to fight. 6 months later, the universe had continued its inexorable expansion, and the lives of those on Flight AU-101 had moved on their trajectories forever altered by that single transatlantic crossing. The ripples from that day had not vanished. They had widened, carving new, and in some cases, deeper channels in the landscape of each person's life. The hard karma that Alistair Finch had delivered hit with the force of a meteor. And for Brenda Jenkins, the impact crater was deep and permanent. The termination was just the beginning. The damning note in her permanent aviation record was a digital ghost that haunted her every attempt to rebuild her old life. Applications to British Airways, Virgin Atlantic, and even budget European carriers were met with a wall of silence or polite immediate rejections. The industry had closed ranks. She eventually found work as a shift manager at a sprawling duty-free store in Gatwick's North Terminal. Her new uniform was a shapeless polyester blazer, her authority confined to scheduling toilet breaks and reprimanding teenagers for sloppy shelf stacking. The bitterness she felt was a corrosive acid in her soul. She hadn't learned a thing. One afternoon, she watched a well-dressed black family laughing as they tested expensive fragrances, and she let out an audible sneer of disgust, muttering to a colleague about people with more money than sense. Her prejudice hadn't vanished. It had just lost its power. The true torture came when she saw gleaming Aura Airlines crews stride confidently through the terminal, their posture perfect, their uniforms immaculate. She would see the pride in their faces, a pride she once wore like armor, and be consumed by a venomous envy that soured her days and haunted her nights. Her trajectory was a downward spiral into a black hole of her own making. Heather Mills, by contrast, had embarked on a trajectory of painful but steady ascent. The shame of that day had been a crucible. After returning to her small Ohio town, she spent weeks in a state of profound self-recrimination. Finally, she knew she couldn't move forward without facing her past. She sat down and wrote a 3-page letter to Dr. Emma Reed, sending it to Aura Airlines' headquarters, with little hope it would ever be seen. "Dear Dr. Reed," it began. "I don't expect you to remember me, but I was one of the flight attendants on AU-101. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about my behavior on that flight. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was morally wrong. I let my fear of my superior and my own weakness make me complicit in treating you with a cruelty you did not deserve. When I spilled the coffee on you, my first thought was not of your well-being, but of getting in trouble. That fact will shame me for the rest of my life. There are no excuses for what I did, only regret. I am writing this not to ask for your forgiveness, which I know I haven't earned, but to offer my deepest, most sincere apology." The letter found its way to Emma's desk. She read it twice, her anger long since faded, replaced by a complex sorrow. She saw in Heather's words a genuine remorse, a person grappling with a profound moral failure. After a week of consideration, she wrote a short, simple note in reply. "Ms. Mills, I accept your apology. The past is fixed, but the future is a matter of choice. The most important thing now is what you do next. Choose wisely." For Emma, it was an act of closure. For Heather, it was a lifeline. She enrolled in social work at her local college, determined to dedicate her life to advocating for others, her past failure now the fuel for a future of compassion. Mark Corrigan, the gate agent who began the cascade of slights, chose a trajectory of pure escape. He cashed out his pension and moved to Thailand, telling friends he was going to find himself. In reality, he was trying to lose himself. The public humiliation of the inquiry was a trauma he couldn't process. He spent his days on a beach, but the shame followed him, a ghost that sat beside him in the tropical sun. He could run from his job and his country, but he couldn't run from his own actions. For Dr. Emma Reed, the experience became an unexpected defining chapter. She accepted the Eddington Medal, her speech on the elegant impartiality of the cosmos carrying a new personal weight that moved the audience to a standing ovation. But her real work began with Alistair Finch. He was obsessed with turning the airline's greatest shame into its greatest strength. Together, they designed the Dr. James Reed Dignity in Service Initiative. It was revolutionary. It moved beyond checklists and corporate jargon, using VR scenarios to put staff directly into the shoes of passengers from diverse backgrounds. It featured powerful video testimonials and focused on the psychology of unconscious bias, how the brain makes dangerous shortcuts and how to intercept them. Initially met with skepticism by some veteran staff, it quickly became a badge of honor, transforming the culture from one of simple service to one of profound empathy. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the incident, Emma found herself in seat 2A of an Aura Airlines A350 flying to Geneva. A young flight attendant with kind eyes and a genuine smile approached her seat. "Dr. Reed," she said warmly, "it is a genuine honor to have you with us. My name is Maria. Before I ask about drinks, I just wanted to say that I'm part of the first graduating class of the James Reed Initiative. The first principle we learned was that a ticket buys passage, but our job is to offer dignity. It changed everything about how I see this job." Emma looked at the young woman, at the unforced respect in her gaze, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She thought of her father, a man who loved the stars because they treated everyone on Earth with the same magnificent indifference. His legacy, she realized, wasn't just in textbooks and observatories. It was here in this small act of human decency, flying at 35,000 feet. "Champagne would be lovely, Maria," Emma said, her smile radiant and completely at ease. "Thank you." As the plane took off, soaring towards the heavens, she knew so well Emma Reed finally felt the last of the chill from that fateful flight dissipate. It was replaced by a gentle, life-affirming warmth. Her trajectory, once knocked off course by petty hatred, had been corrected, pointing her towards a brighter, more hopeful future she had helped to create. This story is a powerful reminder that prejudice often thrives not in loud, overt acts, but in the quiet, dismissive moments, averted eyes, a dismissive tone, a feigned scarcity. It shows how the abuse of small powers can lead to profound cruelty. Dr. Emma Reed's story is a testament to the power of quiet dignity in the face of ugly bias. The shocking revelation of her connection to the airline's owner delivered a swift and brutal form of justice, but the true victory wasn't in the firings. It was in the change that followed the creation of a program that aimed to ensure no passenger would ever be made to feel invisible again. It's a story of how one person's refusal to accept disrespect can send ripples of change through an entire corporate culture, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to being ignored is to ensure you can never be forgotten. If this story of justice and accountability resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate powerful storytelling. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell for more real-life dramas and tales of karma. Thank you for listening.